Alright, there is a mountain of dialogue awaiting me, as you'd expect. How about we resolve this?
Hey. Theos, he had hold of your soul from a long time back, seems like. You get what you needed from him?
I got justice.
Not many can say that these days. Not with the gods using the world to settle their problems. You'll be feeling better soon then. Good. That's real good. You got it figured out what you're going to do about all that?
Yes.
Got a lot of people out there thinking they've been abandoned by their gods. There's not much that'll put the fear in you more than that. You can take my word for it. If it was in my power, and I know it's not, but if it was, I'd find a way to give them the courage to face it. Not because they think there's some god looking out for them, but because they've just got it in them. And after what you've been through, though, I'm sure you got your own ideas. Better make it good.
He winks.
Yeah? Victory looks good on you. There was a blur about your soul that lingers no more. Seems putting Theos to rest has given you some measure of inner peace. Of course, now you need to decide what to do with these trapped souls. You've won the right, if you wish, to use these souls as fodder to strengthen the living. Think of the Hollowborn, think of the victims of animancy gone awry. It would be a great boon to so many. Consider, my watcher friend, that a true hunter provides strength and sustenance for the whole tribe. But that is merely my two pawns on this matter. This is your hunt, your victory, your prize. When I lost my way, you helped steer me back to Gallowayne. I sincerely believe the Seeker God has returned the favor by guiding you to this moment. It has been an honor to be a part of your pack.
Following your lead, we've come to the end of it, my friend. It has been an honor to walk this road with you, and I will regret our parting.
I will not stay in Rawatai long, I think. If it means to change, I see there is nothing I can do to stop it. There are many places yet to see, mysteries to unravel. Kana inclines his head. And while I cannot say I aspire to match your fierceness, I cannot deny it saved us on many occasions. I thank you.
Aye? Astounding. I always knew the Leaden Key stood for something big, but I didn't quite realize what I'd gotten myself into. And now, you're in the middle of something even bigger. With a decision that will affect millions. This is beyond either of us. The certainty of the gods is a mercy. Power like this is a heavy burden. Just look at how it crushed Theos. Perhaps he was right to surrender it to Woodica.
Theos was wrong.
It's your decision, of course. And whatever you decide, I'm glad our paths crossed in Gilded Vale.
Your thoughts must flow deeply indeed.
Theos may be gone, but his crimes, the wounds he has inflicted, remain. Yet before you lies an opportunity to heal, to restore. Only through the healing of families, repairing the bonds between parent and child, reforging the shattered links between generations, can the Deerwood be knit whole once more.
You're right.
People will long remember the legacy. Let them also remember the healing that followed.
Waves of warmth and relief emanate from her mind. Farewell. A little more brief than I expected. So what comes of this? Aptly named just machine.
Yeah.
With your companions bearing witness, you step up to the place where Theos once stood before his people long ago. The great machine lies in front of you, idle, ready. You have seen this machine and others like it in operation. You understand how it works. It is a device for directing souls. As a watcher, it would be a simple matter to influence that direction. Though as big as the machine is, it may be the last thing you ever do. Speak the command to activate the machine. There is a shrieking of stone grinding against stone as old cogs loosen and begin to turn. You have only moments before the souls will be sent into the Adra vein. This will be your only chance at redirecting them. Return the souls to the bodies that they were intended for. You close your eyes and expend your perception outward, taking in the immense totality of the tens of thousands of souls orbiting the chamber. Your grasp on the souls is tenuous. You find yourself fighting to keep them all within your influence, and you can feel them slipping away from you as the machine gains speed. A brief moment comes when it feels as though you hold all of them at once, and their force is so great it feels as though they will tear you apart. In that moment, you dedicate your entire being to bending their orbit, channeling their flow in a new direction.
At your command, the ancient device became your instrument, spinning to life with deafening resonance and gathering up the swirling essence like thread on a great spindle. There, in the pale pulsing glow of the machine that set you on this path long ago, you summoned all your strength, focusing on your objective and blocking out all else. With a single concussive blast that rocked the chamber and sent you tumbling to the ground, you freed the souls from their stasis. Exhausted, your consciousness slipping away, your last sight was of the machine, dark and dormant. Then your eyes closed, and sleep welcomed you at long last. After coming to and searching for some time, you discovered the route Theos used to enter Sun in Shadow, and embarked on a long and arduous ascent back to the surface. You emerged in Ter Evron after days of tunneling through the rubble Theos had left behind, and when you stepped into the daylight, you were faced with a different Deerwood than the one you had left. At your direction, the souls diverted by Theos were guided back to the vessels originally meant for them. For the first time, parents of hollow-born children woke to the cries of their infants and looked into their eyes to see them staring back. People fell to their knees where they stood, thanking Helia or Mogren or even Aethys for their forgiveness of whatever guilt they felt they bore. But for all the relief that had come to some parents, others only found new grief. For many thousands of Hollowborn had died during Wide One's legacy, many by their parents' own hands. For those children, there would be no homecoming. Yet the last Hollow birth was in the past now, and those parents willing to risk trying for a new child were frequently rewarded, often with twins. Many felt they saw Helia's hand in it, and the year would be remembered as the year of Helia's splendor. Lord Radric's zeal had brought him back to life once, but it would not do so again. Radric's destruction at your hands spelled the end of his suffocating rule over Gilded Vale and the surrounding area. In his absence, the village prospered, becoming a popular destination for new settlers anxious to leave Defiance Bay after the riots. Without a nearby ruler, it also grew more wild, with many settlers moving on as soon as they'd arrived, turned off by lawlessness that was excessive even by Deerwooden standards. Nevertheless, despite the challenges of living there, Gilded Vale had survived, and would continue to survive for the foreseeable future. Following the assassinations of Duke Avar Wolfgren and Lady Webb, Defiance Bay was thrown into political upheaval. In the ensuing weeks, the streets had become the domain of looters and blackguards. few dared to step outside their own doors alone or unarmed. But order was soon re-established by the Knights of the Crucible, who, despite their depleted numbers, had gained favor in the public eye for their role in the unraveling of the conspiracy surrounding Widewind's legacy, and were quickly reinforced by returning forces from Fleetbreaker Castle. For the Knights, their resurgence marked a return to the tradition as well. Having seen firsthand the dangers presented by dabblers in animancy, the Order quickly abolished the practice internally, preferring the familiarity of their hammers and forges to the uncertainties of Essence and Adra. Their identity rediscovered, the Knights suppressed their political aspirations and began once again to train their recruits in the art of blacksmithing, recapturing the post-revolutionary ideals of Deerwood and regaining the respect of its citizens as a result. Though the machine atop Ter Noaneth had been disabled, it had not seen its last use. Heritage Hill was rebuilt, and no sooner had the first families moved in to resettle the district than members of the Leaden Key, acting under standing orders from their Grand Master, climbed the tower and reactivated the machine. The initiates slew a handful of the new settlers under cover of night and watched as history repeated itself, the victims reanimating and devouring the survivors. After this second incident, the district would remain abandoned.
What the fuck, Aloth?
The Duke's assassination at the apparent hands of an animancer had caused catastrophic rioting in the streets of Defiance Bay. But those who had escaped the melee in the palace hearings remembered the testimonies of the strange guest who had shown up that day and absolved animancy, implicating the Leaden Key instead. The rumor spread quickly, and soon the popular belief was that the assassin had been a Leaden Key spy. When the legacy had lifted, people came to see it not as a sign that the riots had been according to the gods' wishes, as Theos had hoped, but as a confirmation that animancy had never been the source of the problem in the first place. Deerwoodans instead convinced themselves that the riots had somehow purged Defiance Bay of Leaden Key spies, and that the end of Widewind's legacy was their well-deserved reward. The rage against animancers was quickly forgotten, and those who had survived were permitted to return to Brackenberry Sanitarium and rebuild it so they might resume their studies. The town of Deerford had seen the last of the cult of Scan. Dark rumors about the town's many curses quickly faded, and travelers soon returned. Abidon's renewal brought new vigor and purpose to a god long known for quiet, steady labor. Handicraft saw a revival in the Deerwood, and no smith wanted for an apprentice. Additionally, Abidon's restored interest in preservation led to redoubled efforts to survey Engwithan ruins. Animancers and craftsmen alike found much to study, but tensions with Aer Glanfath rose. As for Stalwart, the Battle of Caron's Scar only strengthened their resolve to unlock the mysteries of Durgan steel and build new marvels with the White Forge. However, Stalwart's ambitions brought them into further conflict with the Raid Serens, as more and more impoverished communities gathered at the border and vowed to finish the work of the Iron Flail. It would be many generations before the region saw peace. The Flames That Whisper clan found a cautious peace with Stalwart, particularly once the villagers heard of the aid the ogres had offered against the Eyeless. The clan moved back into the Russet Wood, and as Stalwart grew in prestige, the villagers formed a tighter alliance with their ogre neighbors. Within a generation, ogre traders visited Stalwart, and village hunters were welcome in the Russet Wood. Harmka's death had brought the Devil of Carrick little satisfaction. In time, her taste for vengeance soured. What replaced it was a hunger to feel something, anything, new. Summer had thinned the snowpack twice over when she felt the joint at her elbow first begin to stiffen. She turned her back on the hopes of animancy and civilization and walked east. She pushed through the mountains, past Raid Ceres, and into the broad plains of Ishamiddle. She had forgotten what it was like to simply journey, no goal or destination in mind. Though she felt nothing more than the steady thump of her feet on the road, The endless horizons and grassy meadows were new to her. She measured her time in the gradual rusting of her body and was satisfied. Her movements slowed, but so did the world around her. Waist-high grasses undulated and tacked in the wind, as gradual as the tides. Sparrows and blackjays made steady pilgrimages across the sky, each flap of their wings a solemn salute. She could hardly move when she found something she had never seen before: the ocean. With the last of her strength, she pulled herself beneath the water, content at last to feel the movement of currents and the constant caress of the waves. Zawa came to understand that the time of the Dakan had passed. With his soul no longer fettered to worldly concerns, he grew to become the enlightened Anitle his shaman had foreseen. He took up in an empty monastery near Cold Flow Lake, and word began to spread of his presence there. He taught pilgrims and students how to leave behind their vanity, their fear, and even their past. He invited those who studied with him to share their newfound knowledge, so that all might free themselves from suffering. Once Maneha had made peace with her memory, she decided the time had come to face her more recent past. For the first time in decades, she returned home to Rawatai, and she found that it had changed as much as she had. New districts had sprung up along the coast, while others withered into crumbling husks, and the streets had changed their course as surely as rivers. Her parents wept with joy at her return. They still ran the old spice shop, and in its many aromas and flavors, she found memories of the places she'd traveled and the people she'd known. She told her story, bottle by bottle, and began to build a life on the soil she knew best. The fortress of Cadnua emerged as a bastion of security in the midst of an untamed land, becoming the envy of every thane and earl in Deerwood. Legend grew over time of its impregnability, and stories of formidable invaders easily scattered by the keep's defenses became popular around the hearths of Deerwoodinians. Likewise, it also became a beacon to travelers, merchants, and visiting dignitaries alike. Reputed as the finest fortress in all Deerwood, people would journey from near and distant lands alike to experience its fabled hospitality and grandeur. The Audra dragon known as the Master Below, her soul now housed in the body of the huntress Fallen Roet, passed out of Deerwood in relative anonymity, her final destination unknown, even to herself. She was last seen in the port town of Rhodes End, boarding a ship, an Audra talisman glowing about her neck. Palagina had gone against the Duke's Bell's orders by inventing a new trade arrangement with the Anamenfath to accommodate the recovering Deerwooden market. With the Deerwood's people still weakened by Widewind's legacy, the Valian republics easily pushed their would-be competitors out of the market. For her outrageous insubordination and audacity, Palagina was banished from the republics. She traveled north in the Eastern Reach, avoiding Valian ports and entering the ranks of the kind wayfarers. Despite her bravery and dedication to those in her care, her strange appearance made her feel like an outsider wherever she went. With your business concluded, Haravius quietly took his leave and headed home to Thane Bog. The elders of the Fisher Crane had not warmed to Haravius in his absence, and when he arrived, he was denounced and scorned. Haravius spoke of his deeds and of his communion with Galawain, yet none would support his petition to return to the tribe. One by one, starting with the oldest, Haravius challenged each member of the council to single combat, humiliating the Riau in a series of savage duels. With half the council bloodied and shamed, the elders at last acknowledged Haravius' strength, announcing him a hunter of the Fisher Crane tribe. Upon being granted this title, Haravius calmly left the village and embarked again on his life of wandering. Adair chose not to return home to Gilded Vale. Still most comfortable far from cities, he settled in Deerford, which, like many towns in the Deerwood, was beginning the slow process of rebuilding. Believing now that it was the obligation of Kith to be the leaders their gods had not, Adair was soon named mayor of the town, and under his guidance, Deerford soon began to prosper. He expelled the last of the Scanites from the area and drew new settlers with the offer of land, a trick he had learned from someone he otherwise preferred to forget. With each passing day, Deerford would come to more closely resemble the gilded vale of Adair's childhood, the one worthy of its name. When the dust settled in sun and shadow, Aloth looked upon the remains of Theos Ix Arcanon, his former master. He saw where the Grandmaster had gone wrong, and he knew what he would do better. The secret of the gods would be preserved, and with it, the sanity and well-being of all Kith. He donned the remains of Theos's ceremonial garb and prepared himself for the long and lonely task ahead. With the Watcher's goals accomplished and his own vows fulfilled, Kanarua sailed back toward Rawatai, thinking on the lessons his travels had provided him. By the time he landed at Tekoa, he understood what his path must be. Standing before the Lore College, Kanarua explained that the tablet he sought had been destroyed, and so a true interpretation of the Tonvi Oratoa could no longer exist. The people of Rawatai would have to create their own. He described the many strange things he had seen in his travels, and announced his intent to pursue the accumulation of knowledge abroad, seeking answers to new questions. True to his word, Kana soon set sail on yet another expedition, and in Tekoa, his passionate accounts inspired many to follow in his footsteps. With Theos defeated and the souls released from sun and shadow, healthy children were born once again in the Deerwood. The grieving mother sought a place where she might do penance for the birthing bell. She returned to Deerford, where, to the astonishment of the villagers, she delivered the first healthy child in over a decade. She remained there, and with each new birth, she saw a measure of hope restored to the Deerwood and a measure of grace for her own troubled past. Durrance used Magrin's strength only until Theos had been cast from the world, and then swore off her influence entirely. Regret came to weigh heavily on his mind, and a man who had never previously lacked for words or opinions came to embrace silence and contemplation. He continued to wander, penniless and destitute, searching now not for the reason for his goddess's silence, but for a mechanism for revenge. The charred robes he continued to wear as a reminder that he had been burned by his goddess, and not just by the flames of the Godhammer. In her 4-month journey back to Nositoc, Sagani found that the landscapes she traveled had become strangely colorless, the food bland and unsatisfying. She watched the Deerwood, Air Glonfoth, the Valian Republics, and the lands beyond slide by with a dull sense of dread. She returned home to great celebration, yet the words of joy and congratulations rang hollow to her. Old beloved songs sounded toneless. The rituals of changing seasons became drudgery, and Sagani experienced her life back in Masuk as if in someone else's skin. So she fought to feel the worth of her actions, or at least to let her village feel them. She led ever longer and more ambitious hunts, mentoring the younger rangers who followed her. On one such expedition, her party was beset by a blizzard, and she pressed on where her companions turned back. She did not return to Masuk. For you, the death of Theos brought an end to your waking visions, and a silence to the whispers of the past. In their absence, you were able to sleep. The questions of a distant lifetime ceased to trouble your soul. All that remained was what to make of the answer. But at the moment, there was little to be done, and the matter would have to wait. A long journey loomed ahead.
And there it goes. Some really bad endings for Pallegina and Sagani. I guess also a bad ending for Durrance, but it's not a surprising one. It's like exactly what everyone would have expected to happen to Durrance. Whereas Sagani and Pelaginas are more tragic in a way that turrets can't be. The way that choices were implemented into your companion's quests at times was iffy. Sometimes it felt like something that should have never been my choice at all, and sometimes it felt like it was iffy that it was even my choice. Like, even in the moment, it felt like I was at best making a suggestion, and then they completely reinvent their entire lives on a whim based on a thing that I said in a moment as an outsider, and that always felt a little weird to me. It's not completely abnormal for RPGs because you have so much power in these worlds, but there's definitely an element of like, it felt like, strangely, like it took them too little pushing to massively change as who they are as people, or make a choice that was irresponsible or completely outside of what they might have wanted to do just because I said something in a moment. That's mainly for Heravius and Palagina, where I'm like, wow, there's some really big outcomes for what I said, and it's rough because you just can't be that specific, and you can't know all the details that well, and you're kind of like, on a whim, I decided the entire trade relationship between multiple entire nations, between the republics and Glanfath and the Deerwood, and I'm like, I don't know anything about trade, but for some reason I was able to control that choice, and then Palagina suffers the consequences of my ill choice, where apparently the choice we made in order to help the Deerwood didn't even happen, so it still didn't work, and the Republic still got what they wanted, and everything was a mistake anyway, so that was a little weird too. Huh. Maybe that was conditional, like if you strengthened the Deerwood, maybe that changes the outcome of Palagina's ending. It might be that what ending you choose as a player affects the endings of individual companions, and so like maybe you make one choice in the dialogue, but then a secondary condition is decided by something else that you do, like the ending. The back and forth of like Galloway, or like every time you talk to Heravius, you can weirdly say something about Galloway or something about Whale, and I guess I don't know. Interestingly, I think I said I indicated Whale basically every time I talked to him, I think, until the very final time where I said something about Galloway, and that was apparently the choice where you decide his entire destiny was that dialogue choice, and it's like, alright, huh. The consequences of which exact moments are going to have consequences and how big they're going to get was definitely a surprise moment to moment. Like, I made Aloth the leader of the Leaden Key, but we didn't get to discuss what that meant, like what his role was going to be as the leader of the Leaden Key. Like, is his job to... it seems like he took it as me saying that Theos was right and that he should continue doing everything that Theos did, which is definitely not what I meant. I definitely meant like somebody needs to take charge of this organization because it does already exist. Having them just kind of splinter or even just make a new leader on their own outside of our control was a mistake because they were dangerous. So having somebody I could trust at the head seemed like a good idea. But then the dialogue seems to indicate that like he went on to do what they wanted. He seemed to almost just continue being more like Theos. And then that terrorist attack happened under his watch, as far as I can tell, where they fucking attacked Defiance Bay again and zombified everybody again. And I'm like, Aloth, what the fuck? what the fuck? I don't know. In general, I've been over before how the companions just aren't amazing in this game. Their motivation for sticking with you for the entire campaign is super shaky, which is often a thing in these games, so it's not really specific to this game, but definitely like definitely a little surprised by how committed they are to sticking around, considering what some of their motivations were. But yeah, you kind of just get the dump, all the dialogue dumped on you at once in most of the cases. and then you just kind of do one little quest for 20 minutes, and then you're done with that character. Some of them are better than other ones. Like, there's some clunkiness in Haravius's, but going to the whole place that argues about the meaning of his beliefs was interesting. Whereas some of them are kind of flat and abrupt. I can kind of appreciate the idea of how Durance and Grieving Mother both have a system where you get their dialogue periodically throughout the game, but because the game doesn't have a tempo built into it for you to talk to these people on a periodic basis, it kind of feels like it's not the best implemented system. Like, they want you to prod these people, but you have no idea what's going to cause it. In hindsight, I think it was the act transitions and maybe specific events in the story that would allow you to then do the next dialogue, but it was kind of iffy which one it was going to be. Some of it seemed to be triggered by sleeping, but other parts were triggered by you talking to them, and it was unclear sometimes whether, especially in Grieving's mother's case, whether you do it by talking to them and then just letting time pass. Like when you were stuck, you didn't know if it was because you needed time to pass, or if you needed for your character to sleep a number of times, or if you needed to be in a different act transition, or if it's because you had to play like a little puzzle. Because like you did these little visions that were kind of like little puzzles, and it was hard to tell sometimes whether you hadn't had dialogue with her for 30 hours was because you just hadn't correctly solved her puzzle, or if it was because you just hadn't done the actual trigger that lets the next step become available. And I found myself wishing that the game would better show you that new dialogue was available, because I would talk to somebody and then they would say something about a quest I did like 20 hours ago, and I'm like, oh, I guess we haven't talked since then, and you had dialogue. And like, they have the system where they have a little quote box that tells you, hey, I want to talk to you now, but only sometimes. It basically only seems to be about, this character would like to comment on the quest you're doing right now. But if you do something that triggers them having new dialogue that isn't directly related to the current quest, they don't gain any kind of notification saying that they'll talk to you now, which means that you don't really know that it's time to talk to them. And that's just kind of, it just led to things being a little more awkward than it needed to be. We're on Kickstarter backers now, so I'll go ahead and fast forward these credits. At least more than one times. So I have some qualms with the game. Companions are my favorite part of RPGs in many cases. Not always. Sometimes it's the choices, or sometimes it's even the mechanical systems can be the best part. But oftentimes I just really like hanging out with the companions, learning their story, and how that's paced and how it's voice acted and how it's implemented in the story is important to me. And I would say that that's one of the reasons I probably like BioWare so much, is that in Dragon Age and Jade Empire and Mass Effect, they just handle the companions super well in almost every case. And that's just kind of the gold standard to some extent. And some of these other RPGs I've played might have more companions, or they might even have companions that have more interesting concepts. But then in practicality, the presentation often doesn't quite keep up with that. In this game, it had a number of things holding it back. It doesn't have... the companions don't have crazy multi-layered information to gain over the course of the playthrough that makes you feel like you're slowly getting closer to them over the course of playing through the game. In many of their cases, you can read 100% of their dialogue immediately, unlock their quest, and then they completely are a static, flat character that at best has an occasional quip until you do their quest. And the quest is only like 20 minutes long for each character, or shorter in some cases. Sometimes you just happen to incidentally get to a location that's important to them, and you do one dialogue and then the quest is over, whereas other companions had more interesting stuff to do. And then you just kind of talk about the quest a little bit while it's happening, basically, and then they kind of just vanish from the game, and a lot of them don't have anything else to say for the rest of the game, aside from little quips here and there, and, you know, some final dialogue if you take them on the final quest. And so it's just kind of flat. It's hard to compare this to, like, Rex from Mass Effect 1, for example. A character who, like, there's a bit of a mixed bag sometimes with level of interestingness from character to character in Mass Effect 1 in particular, but Rex is somebody who, from day one, he seems like this kind of person. Then you talk to him more, and he has more dimension to his character, and he turns out to have a direct tie to a really important plot point about the entire world. So he's tied to the world building, but also in a way that's personal to him, because you hear about the oh god, what do they call it? It's not a good day for terminology remembrance, apparently. The Krogan, the things the Solarians did to the Krogans. Really? Oh, the genophage. There we go. I'm like, come on, it's like my favorite game. Like you hear about the genophage through him, and over the course of the trilogy, you're like, this is actually really important to him as a person. But you get more dimension with him. He has like a bunch of cool interactions. BioWare is really good about having characters interact during unrelated quests. That helps reinforce their personality type. Morgan is also a really strong character in the first Dragon Age that has a really particular personality that you get to kind of pick away at over the course of the playthrough. And then like you get to the big climax, you're like, oh shit, actually the stuff that maybe kind of seemed like Rex was past, because he kind of like went past the genophage stuff and was kind of hopeless. He sees hope, and he has this big climactic moment where he actually has something to care about, and like this is his big time to step up. And like, I don't know, I like it when a character has a reaction to the main story and has investment in what's happening in the campaign, because it kind of helps explain why they're there, but also when big events are happening in the world, sometimes what helps you care about those events is the characters that you care about caring about those events. Because when this entire campaign and the one that's added for the expansion is primarily about the Watcher going on his solo adventure, and he just happens to have companions, it's kind of a bummer. You kind of prefer to have people that feel like they're particularly invested in what's going on in more direct ways, because what's happening directly matters to them more, because then every step of the way they're kind of reacting in certain ways, and you kind of might even be pushed to have certain choices go certain ways because you care about certain characters and how they would think about that choice. But like you look at this cast of characters and you basically have, like, I would say primarily there's Aloth, who is obviously tied because he's a member of the Leaden Key. And then there's Grieving Mother, because of her specific story being specifically tied to the Hollowborn. But then a lot of the other characters are just kind of here. Like, Sagani is a nice character. I like characters like Sagani and Maneha and Zawa. But boy, does their plot have nothing to do with the main story or the White March's story. They're just kind of, well, Maneha, we do visit the location that Maneha cares about over the course of the White March, but she doesn't interact directly with those people. Like, it's like their implementation's just kind of and so I just don't find myself having I have to manufacture caring about these characters more than normal, whereas it's a lot more natural with certain RPGs than others, and that they could just do with a bit more depth and a bit more implementation, which is hard. It's a real big game, and a lot of characters being switched out, and they eventually put it up to 12 characters while trying to give them all dialogue here and there throughout the game. But I think just maybe having the dialogue come out over the course of different periods of time might be better. Like have more of them have dialogue that's more similar to Durance and Grieving Mother, where it's paced out over the course of the playthrough, but also have it so that said dialogue has a better notification system, so you can find out when it's happening. Because right now you can just get all of it at once, and that's just kind of flat, and it makes the characters non-dynamic. I kind of liked it when you went, like, in Knights of the Old Republic, you do a big planetary mission, and all that stuff happens, and you have a couple companions with you, and they react to things and so on, but then you get back to the ship, the Ebon Hawk, or you go to your camp in Dragon Age, or you go to the Normandy, and you kind of do your little tour where you talk to all your different characters. Like, you kind of have, like, a rest moment that you're used to associating with the idea of talking to your various companions. And like that part's just kind of nice, but also helps it so that they can then create a structure where those companions kind of open up with their layers over time. Like a lot of characters have a pretense where they're untrustworthy or untrusting and don't want to tell you things about them, and they're kind of standoffish and rude, and then over the course of the playthrough they slowly open up and you discover these kind of either these dark pasts they have, or the things that they regret, or the reasons why they don't like people like you, or the fact that they're actually a traitor or someone, or just so many other things. And like, I'm just imagining like a system where Aloth gets a ton of screen time and gets to say a bunch of different things, and you get to meet both him and his alternate personality more. Whereas in this playthrough, you meet Aloth stumbling out of a bar, getting attacked because of his other personality, and you're really interested in that. And then where does it go? Kind of nowhere. He has a second personality. You eventually find out it's because he's it was a thing that was awakened in him, but it was awoken because he was being abused. So you go to like a little counseling session where you kind of don't accomplish much of anything besides talk about it a little bit more. And then Aloth completely drops that aspect of his personality for the rest of the playthrough. And it's primarily expressed by occasional jokes from Adair and characters like that, who like characters who either prefer the other personality or just kind of want to play with her or whatever, or just kind of want to have some fun, is like the best you get, because Aloth doesn't have any further arc to do with that character, and she never speaks again. Like, she just doesn't talk anymore for the rest of the game, despite that setup. And then it gets kind of supplanted with the idea, or like when he reveals, actually, I'm a member of the Leaden Key, which also does like, that's like that seems like it goes 0 to 100, but then it kind of doesn't come up again until the end of the game. Like, it's, despite being so much longer than RPGs I've played, the companions actually got way less dialogue and way less development and steps to their development than most of them. And Aloth technically gets more steps than some of these other people, whereas Sagani is just like, this is my quest. And then you kind of just, what if they're over here? Nah. What if they're over here? Oh no, it's dead. The end. And then she goes home sad because she can't go home again because she's so addicted to adventure now or something. And this was all, maybe this was all an excuse for her to actually stay away from becoming a household wife, because she wanted to stay on adventure forever, and this was her excuse, and that's why she was able to commit to such a long adventure on such a kind of weak pretense and so on, even though it was kind of costing her back at home and so on. Like, she's an interesting character. I like her writing and her story, and like what I can draw from what it seems she was like when it reveals like her ending and stuff like that. But like, her stakes in the main story don't exist. She just is kind of there. And her actual story, while having an interesting twist, like the reveal, like, oh no, not only is it an animal, like she said that they can sometimes be, it's an animal that's dying right now, and that kind of bummer. But boy, do you not do anything, mostly. You just stumble upon the animal one day when you get to Iarglanfath, and then the quest just ends, and then she goes back to not being a character. She just goes back to being an archer that you order around in combat. I don't know. I just hope I hope they handle companions better. I played Tyranny already. I don't remember if that was an improvement or not, but I think it might have been, actually. I think those characters might have been somewhat better implemented, but Tyranny has its own issues with its weird faction system, and the timing at which you make choices was all iffy, but I went over that during that playthrough. So I just hope that the companions are better handled next game, because that's one of the things that I care about in RPGs that have parties, is that I care about the particular characters. And that's something that really got me through Dragon Age Inquisition, which has so many problems on so many levels, on other levels, but all the companions were like such a highlight. And that's something that definitely BioWare flexes on, is when they do like their Mass Effect 3 final DLC that's all about just having a party with all the characters that they've developed over the course of a trilogy, because they have so much personality to flex on there. And this game gets that a little bit, because this game does have the companion-to-companion dialogue left and right with the different characters getting to chat back and forth sometimes, but they just need more. They just need more to do. This is kind of the issue. They just need more to do, and I think that adding more interesting interactions to the existing characters might have been a better use of time than adding 3 more for the expansion. But I guess you can't sell an expansion on the idea that the existing characters talk more. You sell you sell an expansion on the idea of like, here's a new class, or here's a new map, and here's a new companion to meet and stuff. So I guess that they're kind of stuck with that. But I would hope for better. The implementation of voice acting, I understand why they might only voice act some lines and not other lines. Like, I'm fine with that because it's a budgetary constraint and it's a huge amount of writing to voice act. Obviously, I prefer, as a Let's Player, to just have all of the voice acting voice acted because it's less confusing to do a Let's Play of, and it's also kind of it lets me lean back a second and not just have to say every single line with all the complicated terminology and weird made-up words and guessing how they all are pronounced and all that. It's kind of nice to have them all voice acted with their own personalities and all that. Makes my job a little easier. But my main issue is that the voice acting is badly implemented in many cases, because what they do, and I've talked about this plenty, but I'm in review mode right now, I guess. What they do is that they voice act only the dialogue in the middle of a paragraph. So like it'll be like paragraph of descriptive text, dialogue, more descriptive text, dialogue, more descriptive text, all in one screen, and they'll just snipe out the little voice acted lines of the character talking. But like, you wrote that dialogue for people to read, presumably. Not the dialogue, the descriptions, the non-dialogue. You wrote all of that for people to read, presumably. So it doesn't make any sense for the voice acting to just kind of randomly snipe in mid-paragraph without any of the surrounding stuff being read. Like, they really needed to they either needed to read the dialogue, if they're going to read the dialogue, they need to have the voice actor also read all the descriptions that are on that particular page so that it all flows correctly. Or they need to make it so that every time you hit next and voice acting happens, it shows the voice acting first, and then it reads that voice acting, and then any descriptions are after that. And then if they're going to keep talking, you can hit continue, and it'll start each slide with some spoken dialogue followed by some non-spoken description. In that system, the dialogue, which triggers the moment you hit continue, can play out. You can hear the dialogue, and then you don't have to read the quote, which is a different color. Because the quotes, all the dialogue's white, while all the descriptions are gray-ish. You hit continue, it plays the voice acting, and you're like, okay, cool, that's what he said. You don't have to check the white text because that was just spoken out loud. You read the gray text to yourself, then you hit continue, and it speaks out the next white text, and then you read the gray text to yourself. And that's a tempo that makes sense. It makes absolutely no sense to hit continue, and it brings up a slide that starts with a gray text that you presumably have to read to yourself, but while you're trying to read it to yourself, the game starts voice acting the lines over that, so you can't read it because the game's currently talking and you're getting wires crossed in your head. But also then the game will read this chunk of dialogue, then skip over this description, then read this chunk of dialogue, then skip over this description, then read this chunk of dialogue, meaning you essentially have to then reread the entire screen from scratch, and then just kind of, when you reach the dialogue parts, imagine what the voice actor sounded like a moment ago when he was reading the whole screen out of order like a lunatic. Like, I don't think it's much of a stretch for me to say that that's like a massively nonsensical way to handle dialogue voice acting. Like, it's not necessarily bad that the descriptions are not voice acted, but they need to be segregated in a tempo that makes sense. Because if you skip over dialogue, if you're skipping over the descriptions to read the dialogue immediately, you're in trouble. You either need to make it so that people can either do the tempo I said a moment ago, or make it so that dialogue does not autoplay and people click the dialogue to make it voice act. Like, I have a little speaker icon next to it or something to indicate that that's dialogue you can hear when you click to it when you get to that part. Because you never want to open up a page of a book that for some reason is an audiobook hybrid, I guess, which is what this is. That's why it's a weird metaphor, but it's what this is. If you had a weird like audiobook that was made of paper, where you open your paper book and it does the audiobook readings of things, but only sometimes, you wouldn't want to open up the page and randomly the quote that's 3/4 of the way down the page is immediately said out loud. You're like, I'm not there yet. I don't even know why he's saying that yet. I got to get to that part. Because you read things in the order in which they're written. I'm belaboring this point weirdly, but it's just like, I don't know, I'm preemptively arguing against the person that in any way tries to defend this, because it's nonsense. It's complete nonsense. It had to be a thing that they like were too busy and they just maybe they implemented voice acting too late in the process when they'd already implemented all the dialogue of the game and just kind of had to roll with it. Because if I remember correctly, the thing I suggested earlier, that the tempo that makes way more sense, I think that's how I think that is how Tyranny worked, is that they handled it way smarter. They also made it so that you can highlight various things to get Wikipedia entry descriptions of them, which is great. So you can keep track of who all these gods are. And I've heard, I don't know if this is true or not, but I think I've heard Deadfire, which is Pillars of Eternity 2, Deadfire. I think I've heard that's entirely voice acted. So this problem will just go away, I guess. But I haven't looked into that because I haven't played it yet. Aside from that, one of my gripes is just combat. I don't think CRPG combat has aged well, and I don't think I see I'm not sure if I see the appeal of it. Obviously I have a bit of an issue with how like the characters have so many goddamn spells that you can't keep track of them all, because you have like 4 different characters that each have like 12 levels of spells, and each of those levels has like 6 spells per thing, and you have to keep track of all that. Like, I love having a spell book as a druid player in D&D, but that's when I play one character, and I habitually play that one character for many dozens of hours, learning them thoroughly, and also very gradually learning those spells. Having that many spells over the course of many characters, and when you're switching out different party members on the fly to experiment with different compositions, or just wanting to take people on certain adventures just to give them more airtime and stuff like that, doing that is kind of rough with that many spells. But that's not my main complaint. That's just a side thing. But Tyranny did revamp its spell system as a weird other system that I think I remember making more sense, which was interesting. They made it a series of symbols that in conjunction mean certain things. So they kind of broke down the base elements of what a spell is, as opposed to all these pre-made spells. But I could be wrong. We played Tyranny like 2 years ago, I think. I need to take a drink of water. I guess I might as well play those credits at normal speed because they're still going. Fuck it, might as well just play them again while I'm talking, even though they probably won't finish while I'm sitting here. But no, when I say that I don't think that CRPG combat has necessarily aged that well, it's just that it's completely incomprehensible. You have a party of 6 fighting probably another party of 6, all in real time, all performing crazy actions, and like, if it's people auto-attacking, sure, I get the idea of what they're doing, but every single character has several abilities and maybe dozens of spells, and shit just goes down. So like, in a turn-based RPG, like Final Fantasy or whatever, every individual character declares what spell they're casting. So like, they cast a spell and the screen tells you what the spell is, and you see it affect somebody. It's like, this spell hit these 3 party members, or just this 1 party member. Oh no, that person took 6,000 damage. Oh, those 3 people took 10 damage, but they're taking a damage over time now, or they're silenced, or they're stoned, or they're poisoned, or whatever. So you can clearly tell turn to turn what's happening. Darkest Dungeon. Druid Stone, which is one of the best games I've played this year. Druid Stone was all about having clarity during combat, at least most of the time. In a lot of these games I have certain complaints where something just isn't quite clear enough, but Druid Stone was pretty good at a lot of the stuff. Understanding what's happening in combat is pretty important if you're trying to make tactical decisions of any kind, really. Eventually I just turned my team into an autopilot wrecking ball and just threw them at people. Just said, go ahead, just use all the spells you want and be aggressive and just kind of go for it. And I would just I would usually let that just happen at its own rate and just go for that. And I was kind of happy to have that option. And it was just in situations where things got really dire, I would then try to take manual control of my most powerful spellcasters and really try to take more specific control of what they're doing to try to turn the thing around. But by and large, despite the fact that I was kind of autopiloting through combat, I found it preferable to do that than to turn the difficulty up, because making this system harder sounds exhausting and infuriating. Because in combat, on a regular basis, you kind of just can't tell what's happening or who's doing what. A weird blast happen on the screen, or weird effects are happening, or oh my god, my entire party just suddenly has everyone looked healthy, and then I unpaused for 1 second, and now everyone's dying. What happened? And like, it's just such a process of like, none of these effects are declared when they're happening, not only do you not know what abilities people are using, but even if you know what ability they're using, you don't necessarily have a way of figuring out what that ability does or what's happening. You might be able to highlight their character bar to find out what the debuff does if you're lucky, but sometimes even those descriptions are vague. But in many cases, if you just got hit by something, you can't really tell what thing hit you. So you get stuck kind of just slowly trying to scroll your way all the way up the combat bar of like all the different things that have happened just to learn that one piece of information. And then even if you do find it, you might not even really know what you could have done about that. Or like you go there seeking, you kind of naturally seek out that tactical information, but then even when you find it, you don't necessarily, you realize you haven't necessarily even gained information you can really act on in many cases, but maybe you have. But it's just chaos. It's just chaos. And like your ability to tell what's happening is just so strangely out of whack with how a lot of these games tend to work, because a lot of RPGs just are way clearer about the information of what's going on, and not being able to figure that stuff out even when you're trying, like even when you stop dead in your tracks for like 5 minutes to carefully try to like analyze the situation, sometimes you just can't put together what exactly you saw. Meanwhile, it being live action, all real-time chaos with, as we've been over, like some pretty iffy pathing from character to character, like they just get stuck sometimes, or there's other complications that come up and weirdnesses that I don't think this system's necessarily great. I kind of liked the fact that XCOM kind of came up with a particular system, and then Shadowrun, when I played Shadowrun and Wasteland 2, they both took after the system that XCOM kind of made, and they kind of made their own modifications on that system. And like there's kind of a roteness to that system, but it's kind of nice how clear it is. Like there's kind of a cool drama to combat in XCOM and Shadowrun and Wasteland 2, where like, oh god, they're gonna shoot my guy, they have a 60% chance, what's gonna happen, and like the drama of watching each shot get performed, and you kind of know the stakes and you kind of know what's happening. It just leads to combat being more impactful and full of meaning, and you're making choices and knowing what those choices might mean for the situation. I just kind of like feeling like I'm in more control and having a meaningful impact on things, and also being able to apply information and do risk-reward assessments and so on like that. And I feel like the CRPG thing where you just have a fucking, just a weird, it's just like a bag of rocks that you just throw out onto the table and they all roll out, and it's like, that's my party, look at them go, and then the enemy throws all their shit at it, and it just becomes a big old pile of rocks, everything's just hitting each other, and then you're like, I guess I won. It's like, the moment-to-moment realism, I suppose, of it just happening in real time and it being on a big sloppy screen and not on a grid and all that is kind of like, visually it kind of can look cool and it's in its sort of realism a little bit, but I don't think that the lack of control and clarity necessarily helps any part of the system, and I think it might be to the detriment to have that. At the same time, and also Divinity Original Sin 1 and 2 also have a turn-based system, which does not have the XCOM part, where as in like they don't have a grid and they don't have cover and stuff like that, but Divinity also has turn-based combat where you just understand what's happening, and it's just way more compelling to play combat-wise. Like I like real-time combat. Like I prefer playing, like I like my Dark Souls and stuff like that, and I think that the Final Fantasy system is kind of rustic and boring, and that's why even they have kind of left it behind. But like JRPG turn-based combat, even though it was my initial example of clarity, I'm not in love with, because it becomes very repetitive and flat and boring. But this newer system of like an isometric turn-based thing like Divinity or XCOM has gotten to a cool midpoint where you have the clarity and the pacing of a Final Fantasy game, where moment to moment you know what's happening and there's drama to each action and all that, but you have a much more dynamic, interesting thing where instead of people standing in a line and hitting each other, you have a big map and people are moving around on that map and making choices based on how their characters interact with said map, and that's way more interesting than just two JRPG parties that look across a battlefield at each other and just do their attacks on each other. So like I think we've made progress towards a cool thing, and I don't know if classic like Baldur's Gate style CRPG combat necessarily holds a candle to that information. Where like the combat's more interesting to play and more drama filled and more dynamic and interesting, and you know, it just kind of wins on every level. The only real downside is pacing. It can just take a long ass time. So when you're playing a game like that, you got to make the combat matter. So like Shadowrun spends a bunch of time slowly developing why this fight's gonna happen, and then you do a bunch of after a bunch of like story setup, you're like, okay, that's why we're fighting, and then you're like, okay, this fight has context for it, so I can enjoy it, and then but it's gonna be permutated by a lot of not fighting. If a game just spams fighting constantly and it has that combat system, it'll get exhausting fast because it takes so long. One upside of CRPG is that you can just throw your ball of players, your ball of characters at the enemy and just see what happens. It definitely saves some time sometimes. But if your combat encounter isn't interesting enough for you to want to play it in great detail, then maybe that combat encounter isn't complementing the game or its campaign very well to begin with, because you just want to sleepwalk through it anyway. So I'm aware, or I've heard that Pillars of Eternity 2 has a turn-based system, which you think might solve my problems. We'll see. I'm iffy about that. I'm especially iffy if they took the normal not turn-based system and then they like just kind of plastered turn-basedness onto it. Like unless it's very carefully handled and the entire game's balanced around that and so on, then like if it's not very carefully designed with that idea in mind, it might be a disaster. But I can't speak to that. It might be an upgrade. And hey, being able to switch back and forth might be interesting too. Like do turn-based combat during big bad fights where you need to care about every moment, but then maybe don't do turn-based combat when you're fighting like trash mobs and you just want to get to this dungeon because these aren't important fights. So toggling back and forth might be the solution if you want to stick to making CRPG style combat, but also making the boss fights not just be a giant mess. I don't know. I got a bunch of feelings. This came off as more negative than I really meant for it to be, but that's usually the case because I'm trying to voice my concerns, whereas the things I enjoyed, you largely saw me enjoy over the course of the whole game. This is an alright game, but I just think that there's ideas about it that don't necessarily complement what it's going for, and I think there's certain elements that could have been developed better to make the whole thing stronger. And I look forward to seeing how Pillars of Eternity 2 handles the whole thing. But that will not be our next game. I could just use a break from playing the same thing. We have other things on our to-do list. I would say there's probably... I shouldn't make promises. But there might be a decent chance that I'll play Pillars of Eternity 2 before I play the next 2 Witcher games or the other 2 Dragon Age games, for example. Just because I don't really want to open up the envelope that is an entire series, and that I'm still have other series that I'm trying to get through, but standalone games, like some standalone RPGs might happen, or RPGs that might be in a series, but my intention isn't necessarily to play the entire series. But I don't know, I'm just spitballing here, but I do want to play both of the other Dragon Age games and both of the other Witcher games and Jade Empire and KOTOR 1 and 2 and a bunch of other things, none of which will be the next game. The next game is a new release that I've been very much looking forward to. See you then.